Barney Vines knows me better than my brother, and in a sense is my brother. Thank you, Barney. That introduction would have made my father proud, and I'm afraid my mother would believe it. I'm going to violate nearly every standard of good teaching of which I am aware today, starting with the fact that they've told me I must stand here because I'd prefer to walk around and talk to you. So the Harry Kirk Wolf lecture will be a lecture, which normally wouldn't be my most comfortable mode. Second, I came to PowerPoint sort of in a way that Charles Brewer didn't. Charles once told me sometimes it's all power and no point. But I have learned that you're not supposed to put a lot of prose on PowerPoints and then read it to people. But I'm going to do that today because some of what I want you to know about Harry Kirk Wolf and William James and Hartley Burr Alexander should come to you in their words and not mine. So I'm going to show you some of their words. I've also come to believe over the years that you shouldn't teach something about which you're not yourself well informed. I'm going to talk to you today about some historical figures, but I am by no stretch an historian. So probably almost everything I know about teaching you can observe today in negative examples, and the take-home message is don't teach the way Keith does, you know. So, Harry Kirk Wolf and the Harry Kirk Wolf lecture. I'd like to say, first of all, I was so delighted when I got the call to ask if I would do this lecture. And there are reasons for that. As some of you are well aware, Harry Kirk Wolf was a brilliant teacher at the University of Nebraska, which was my graduate program. At that time, almost no one there had ever heard of Harry Kirk Wolf. Now they know something about him and they take some pride in the fact that he was there. But there was a period when I think almost no one at Nebraska even knew that Harry Kirk Wolf had existed. And my good friend Ludi Benjamin, in a biography in 1991, sort of illuminated the community about Harry Kirk Wolf. So it was wonderful for the confluence of my connection to Nebraska and Wolf's connection to Nebraska to be invited to do this, and I'm grateful to the committee for that. Kind of an outline of some things I'm going to try to race through here today. A little bit about Harry Kirk Wolf, who was born in 1858, died in 1918, in connection with William James, who was 16 years his senior, but they overlapped and were both movers and shakers in the early days of American psychology. And then Hartley Burr Alexander, who was Wolf's student at Nebraska and who was about exactly as much younger than Wolf as Wolf was younger than James. I have a few things to say that are consistent with William James' dictum that teaching is an art that must exist within the lines laid down by the science. And I'll say a little about scientific literacy, critical thinking, and complex cognition, and a little bit about psychology and the liberal arts. And I hope my main message, I think, will be that everything that goes around comes around, and that people like William James and Hartley Burr Alexander have things to say that we should still be aware of, even though it's more fashionable today to look at who wrote the last article on educational technology and how can I work that into my next talk. So I'm going to go back a century or so and show you that I really am a geezer and deserve to retire. The people, Harry Kirk Wolf. One of the sad facts about Harry Kirk Wolf is that you can Google anything and find a picture of anybody in the world today except Harry Kirk Wolf. My wife Connie helped me scan this from the cover of Ludi Benjamin's biography of Wolf. I could not find a photograph of Harry Kirk Wolf online. His Wikipedia entry does not have a photograph of him. And that's a sad fact about the history of our field. Maybe it's also commentary on my ineptitude on the internet, I'm not sure. Wolf was a true pioneer in the teaching of psychology. He was the second American to get a PhD with Wundt in Germany. James McKean Cattell was the first, but only 4 months before Wolf. Wolf had studied with Ebbinghaus for a time and then moved to Leipzig to finish with Wundt. He established one of the first fifth or sixth lab in the world at the University of Nebraska, and it was probably the first one that was devoted exclusively to undergraduate teaching. A lot of his students went on to be prominent. 3 of them became APA presidents. He was known for his hard work and long hours with students. He engaged undergraduates in research. He advocated in spirited ways that at one point cost him his job for his program and for money for the program at Nebraska. He was an unwaveringly dedicated teacher. He was known for powerful matters of principle with respect to ethics, a charter member of the APA, one of 31 psychologists. His students included Hartley Burr Alexander, about whom I'll say some more. Bentley was his student, became president of the APA. Guthrie was his student, became president of the APA. Pillsbury was his student, became president of the APA. Other students he influenced, including Harry Hollingworth, who became president of the APA, Lita Stetter Hollingworth, J.P. Guilford, who became APA president, and J. McVicker Hunt, who became APA president. At the time that Hunt was elected, Nebraska had had 6 presidents of the APA. Only 2 other schools had more than 2, and those were California and Michigan, but they were behind Nebraska. I think California by now has had 6, but Wolf made Nebraska in those days simply one of the places to be for the study of psychology, even though today probably 90% of psychologists would have no idea who Harry Kirk Wolf was. William James probably needs less introduction, probably the most important figure in the early history of American psychology. He famously said that the first psychology lecture he ever heard was the first one he gave in 1875. As a teacher, he was something of a hero for women because he supported Mary Calkins at a time when all the men dropped out, and they famously studied psychology by James's fireside, just the 2 of them. Harvard, of course, wouldn't give her a PhD. They offered her a PhD from Radcliffe, and she told them to put it where the sun don't shine because she hadn't studied at Radcliffe. But she also became APA president in 1905. Most relevant to today, James published in 1899 a little book called Talks to Teachers. Hartley Burr Alexander was Wolf's student at Nebraska. Grew up in Syracuse, Nebraska, which is a little village where he exhausted the school curriculum by the time he was 13. Did an apprenticeship in his dad's printing office for a while, went to high school, completed it in a year, and then went to Nebraska where he got a PhD. And went on then, or where he majored in philosophy with Wolf, and then went on to get a PhD, but at Columbia in 1901. He worked as a writer, and one of his claims to fame is that in the Webster's Dictionary, he revised all the entries from bicycle to marriage while he was working on the East Coast as a writer. Came back to Nebraska as a professor in 1908, became a famous iconographer. He wrote material for inscriptions on famous buildings all over the country, including Nebraska State Capitol, the Los Angeles Public Library, the Rockefeller Center, the Metro Life Building in New York, and many others. Lived the last decade or so of his life at Scripps College in California, where he had moved due to his wife's ailing health. In those days, people with respiratory problems and such often were advised to go live in warm, dry places, and that's what he apparently did. One of his most famous quotations is this one from the north portal of the Nebraska State Capitol: "The salvation of the state is watchfulness in the citizen." His bust appears in the Nebraska Hall of Fame in the state capitol. I've gone there to find it because my daughter studied with Tom Alexander, who is Alexander's grandson, is an important American philosopher at Southern Illinois University. His father, Hartley Burr Alexander's son, is one of the most important philosophers in the Native American Indian philosophy in the United States and in the world, so it's a long-standing tradition in that family of philosophers, and my daughter was fortunate to be a part of that in her own way in graduate school. Both James and Alexander had a high regard for teachers and their roles in society. Alexander wrote a little book called Letters to Teachers and Other Papers of the Hour in 1919, and James, of course, as I said, wrote Talks to Teachers in 1899. Today I'll draw on both of those and a little bit from a couple of other things James wrote. I've got 1 or 2 things that come from his briefer course psychology book and commencement address he gave in 1907. When he talked about teaching, James said, "In whatever sphere of education their functions may lie, there's to be seen among them a really inspiring amount of searching of the heart about the highest concerns of their profession. The teachers of this country, one may say, have its future in their hands." I think he was probably right about that. Alexander, in commenting on teaching, said, "Wherefore I say, let us rejoice in the task of the teacher, which is none other than pilotage in the great voyage of spiritual discovery." So the question we might ask is, what can 21st century teachers learn from these extraordinary voices from the past? From James, psychology, he said, is a science and teaching is an art. And sciences never generate arts directly out of themselves. An intermediary, inventive mind must make the application by using its originality. He also said, and this is important to us, to know psychology is absolutely no guarantee that we shall be good teachers. Now, nobody in this room would make the mistake of believing that, but there are people who might think that because you're a psychologist, you automatically will be a great teacher. To advance, he said, to that result, we must have an additional endowment altogether, a happy tact and ingenuity to tell us what definite things to say and do when the pupil is before us. And Alexander had a lament that I've heard around the hallways these days. He said, curriculum is a word I detest. It means a race course, and it suggests to my mind the image of a grand free-for-all in which the children, some with blinders and some with interference guards, are the entries. The teachers with snapping whips and reins taut are the jockeys. The parents are the betters on the sidelines, and the grades are the marks of the course leading up to the finish, where the youngsters come under the line nose to nose at commencement. Teachers today, just as in the era of James and Alexander, face daunting challenges. They require critical thinking and the capacity for complex thought, and the question we might ask is, how well do we prepare today's students for these challenges? We know, for example, that scientific literacy is a problem in the United States. In general terms, 45% of Americans think life has existed for less than 10,000 years and humans were created as they are today within that period of time. 30% of American science teachers say that they receive pressure to omit or downplay evolution from their teaching. About the same number have got pressure to include non-scientific alternatives, and 70% of Americans think that they should, that creation science should be taught along with evolution in American science classrooms. A quarter or more of people don't think that the Earth's climate is changing. More than half of Americans, only slightly more than half of Americans, know how long it takes the Earth to go around the sun. A minority of people think human activity is an important cause of climate change if it does exist. And 59% of people know that humans and dinosaurs didn't live at the same time. A few of us in this room are dinosaurs, but that's a different kind of... in psychology, we have our own examples. 41% of American adults believe in ESP. 73% of intro psych students think it's well documented. More than 80% of adults know about the Mozart effect, and about 3/4 of intro psych students believe it. About half the people surveyed think schizophrenia is split personality. More than 2/3 of people think there's an extraordinary epidemic of autism, and half of the students seem to believe it's caused by vaccines. And who's Wilhelm Wundt? A couple of you have heard me ask this question before in talk. I put this in because a few years ago in a job interview, a young person who was interviewing for a job from a highly specialized but highly prestigious program came to interview, and one of the things that would be in the teaching load for this young person would be introductory psychology. And somehow as we talked about it, Wundt's name came up, and the person said, "Who's that?" And it occurred to me that even PhDs in our field are not immune to misconceptions and lack of important knowledge, and I just thought it was appalling. Maybe it's just my advancing age and the fact that I feel like I've lived history that I think this is important, but it seems to me that it might matter. There are other examples in psychology. Extramission. More than half of students think that the eyes send out energy when you view objects as opposed to the other way around. Subliminal messages, repressed memory, sugar, and hyperactivity, and there, you know the list. You look at Scott Lilienfeld's book and see 50 more. I think we can foster critical thinking by posing clear, precise questions, by gathering, assessing, interpreting, and testing relevant information, recognize our own assumptions, the implications, limitations, consequences, and so forth, and by communicating effectively to get solutions. This comes from the Foundation for Critical Thinking. James would support this idea. He said, if the topic be highly abstract, show its nature by concrete examples. If it be unfamiliar, trace some point of analogy in it with the known. If it be inhuman, make it figure as part of a story. If it be difficult, couple its acquisition with some prospect of personal gain. We also know that a lot of people think in cognitively simple ways these days. You need only look as far as the political headlines to see that it's fashionable to think in terms of right, wrong, us, them, black, white, yes, no, you, me, and other kinds of simplistic dichotomies. I happen to think that a lot of the problems the world faces are behavioral, and they're nuanced and complex. Things like climate change, it's a matter of behavior. World population is a matter of behavior. Overconsumption of food and resources is a behavioral problem. Violence is a behavioral problem. But I think Mencken was probably right when he said there's always a well-known solution for every human problem, neat, plausible, and wrong. Unfortunately, people who think and get to conclusions in complex, nuanced ways are often seen as wishy-washy and indecisive. We want our politicians to answer yes or no now. When they say they want to refer it for study or wait to see the data, we think that they don't know what they're talking about. And I think that's sad. So what can we teach? Maybe in just a course or two sometimes, because that's all we see of a lot of our students, that would be relevant for students who face the demands of career changes, profound environmental challenges, an increasingly diverse culture, uncertain economic times, and an ethically challenged international business world. What are the most important outcomes we should want for our students to achieve in our classes along those lines? Alexander, writing near the end of the euphemistically named War to End Wars, foresaw the complexity of the task facing teachers. He said the next generation will have set for it tasks more stupendous than these, pertaining not to mechanical and physical, but to human and spiritual problems. Nor is there a phase of social or intellectual life that will not have to be renewed or re-illumined by the men and women of the future. How can we possibly know enough about all of the problems that face our students to teach them solutions? Or should we, or do we have to know enough? Alexander thought maybe not. He said, in the pursuit of studies chosen from so vast an array of subjects, it's all too easy to become absorbed in the details of special mastery at the cost of the loss of an understanding of what the general objects of the study of nature should be. And James, I think, would have agreed with him. He said, to hear some authorities on teaching, you would suppose that physics was one endless round of repeating the same sort of tedious weighing and measuring operation, whereas a very few examples are usually sufficient to set the imagination free on genuine lines, and then what the mind craves is more rapid, general, and abstract treatment. So I think these voices from the past seem to be suggesting what some contemporary students of critical thinking might recommend. Put less emphasis on facts, which doesn't mean they're unimportant, put less emphasis on knowledge for its own sake, and on the separation of process and content. More emphasis on the role of science in society and everyday life, more emphasis on the nature of inquiry, and more emphasis on understanding concepts as opposed to rote learning of facts. That's nothing new to those of you in this room. You're all fine teachers who know these things. I think a major outcome should be scientific literacy, which of course is more than facts. It's an understanding of the process by which we develop knowledge, and it's asking questions about knowledge. Put another way, scientific literacy is knowledge and understanding of the scientific concepts and processes required for personal decision-making, participation in civic and cultural affairs, and economic productivity. Scientific literacy is critical thinking. One could have a fair command of this way of thinking without a vast knowledge of scientific fact, which is science literacy. I've always said that I'd rather have a doctor who knows how to think scientifically than a doctor who knows a lot of scientific facts. Because if you can think scientifically, you can develop the facts. If you only know facts and can't think, when you encounter a problem that escapes the catalog of rote memory that you've assembled, you're in trouble. Alexander said the scientific attitude is of so enormous an importance to society that the greatest educational effort is justified in securing its development in the greatest possible number of citizens. James said the pupil's words may be right, but the conceptions corresponding to them are often direfully wrong. Direfully, that's a great word. He must keep notebooks, make drawings, plans and maps, take measurements, enter the laboratory, and perform experiments. In other words, learn by doing, by being engaged. What is really the only possible training for the doing of original work thereafter. And to bring back Harry Kirk Wolff, he provoked his students to critical thought. Wolff continually prodded his students to think. They were taught to question givens and to recognize the fallibility of authoritative sources. It was not acceptable to say that habit was such and such because William James said so. Students were encouraged to work through problems and issues on their own. So do our psychology courses promote scientific literacy? We can think about some possibilities. For example, do you ask your students to apply their knowledge to issues of personal well-being or health? In a study, researchers found a strong association between soft drink consumption and mental health problems, including hyperactivity in Norwegian teens. Researchers said the associations might be spurious for a variety of reasons, including failure to control for effects of caffeine and possible displacement by soft drinks of other important nutrients. Does this prove the link between sugar and hyperactivity? Well, the author of one popular report thought so. The headline said, "Link proven between sugar consumption and hyperactivity." And the study establishes a scientific link between the consumption of high fructose corn syrup in soda and abnormal mental states. This is a report of the study that I just quoted from. Or how about legal or policy issues? For example, could a victim ID a criminal based on body odor? In a study, 11 people wear T-shirts for 2 days, then try to ID their own shirt using smell from among 12 shirts, 11 dirty ones and 1 control. 3 of them are successful, almost significant. A lawyer concludes that we can ID people by odor. Is she right or wrong? Could our students answer a question like that? They might look at it and say, she's probably right. It's almost significant. But would you want to go to court as an accused felon and have somebody who could get 3 hits out of 12 determine your fate? Maybe not. You can think of lots of other examples that our students might encounter in their lives. In personal decision-making and interpersonal behavior, they're going to have to make job choices, relationships, aggression, pro-social behavior. We all face issues of health behaviors. By the way, one of the things that interests me, that has to do both with health behavior and with national and local policy issues, is that all the politicians are looking at extending the retirement age in the future as far as at least age 70. But this was also the first year in which babies born do not have a life expectancy longer than their parents. So that there are data that suggest that by the time the new Social Security rules take effect, lifespans, if things hold true to form, will be shorter than they are now due to things like diet and exercise and obesity and things like that. But I've never heard a politician ever talk about those 2 sets of data in the same sentence. And probably none of them have ever thought about it in the same sentence. What makes scientific literacy hard? Well, as we know, and I think I saw Steve Chu somewhere earlier this morning, he studied this, and my colleagues Annette Taylor and Patty Kowalski have too. Students tend to believe scientific findings up to the point at which they contradict their own personal beliefs. So science is okay as long as it doesn't impinge upon my ability to believe whatever I want. And students are likely to persist in mistaken beliefs unless we activate and directly confront those beliefs. And even then it's difficult. The data aren't necessarily very encouraging about that. For Alexander, he said, what are called the empirical method and the virtue of suspended judgment or scientific caution are all but special phases of the scientific attitude, and all rest upon the fundamental fact of the love of truth. The empirical method means nothing more than painstaking in the discovery of facts. Suspended judgment means open-mindedness in the reading of facts and a willingness to change one's mind. James said along the same lines, scientific literacy, as I read him, seems to involve empiricism plus reasoning. He said, put a reasoner amongst a set of concrete objects which he's neither seen nor heard of before, and with a little time, if he's a good reasoner, he will make such inferences from them as will quite atone for his ignorance. Reasoning helps us out of situations for which education leaves us without resource. Although they use different words, I think they both are talking about clear, precise, purposeful thinking, which is the kind of language you can find in any current book on critical thought. Now, we briefly thought about what James and Alexander might offer teachers in the way of critical thought. Do they have anything to say about the value of liberal arts education, which is one of my passions, as many of you know, particularly in an era of economic contraction and increased scrutiny of the work of colleges and universities. The medieval curriculum, of course, consisted of the trivium and the quadrivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. I think it's an unfortunate fact that we get the word trivia from the same root, which meant the intersection of three roads. In this case, the three roads are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Today, you'd be more likely to find this kind of a list, art, literature, language, science, and so forth. Consider what some of our forebears in this field were like. Harry Kirk Wolff was well educated in Greek, Latin, calculus, chemistry, rhetoric, and philosophy. John Watson studied Greek, Latin, philosophy, math, biblical studies. Margaret Washburn studied music and chemistry and French. Francis Galton, medicine, astronomy, math, individual differences, and he was an explorer. Lillian Gilbreth, one of my heroes, she studied literature, music, modern languages, and philosophy. John Dewey was chair simultaneously of philosophy, psychology, and education at Chicago. And one of my favorite quotes from B.F. Skinner, I've built apparatuses as I have painted pictures or modeled figures in clay. I've conducted experiments as I've played the piano. I've written scientific papers and books as I have written stories and poems. And Darwin, I don't have it here, but Darwin, near the end of his life, said that he wished he had set aside every week time for poetry and music. James then, of course, was fluent in several languages, widely traveled. He came from an affluent family who could send him off to Europe, and he did that a number of times. He was an accomplished artist, and at one point there was a chance he would become an artist professionally rather than a physician and a psychologist. He studied chemistry, of course, natural history, medicine, religion, philosophy, and so forth. And Hartley Burr Alexander was a philosopher, a poet, an iconographer, a playwright, literary critic, author, historian. To say that any of these people didn't have depth of experience and love for liberal arts, I think would be a mistake. James and Alexander, of course, were classically educated, and they saw the value in integrated liberal arts education. Alexander's Letters to Teachers has chapters on humanities, history, nature and science, the Bible, poetry, the curriculum, even though he didn't like the word, school and community, and lots more. In his letters, Alexander said, if the end of free schools is primarily the liberal education of citizens who can, through understanding and love of it, preserve the state, it cannot be the first purpose of these schools to give the scholar training in particular crafts for the sake of his individual career. In other words, he didn't want the schools to become manual training schools or technical schools. He wanted public schools to provide broad education, and he considered the public school system of Nebraska, where he lived at the time, to be a complete system from elementary school through the state university. He saw it as what it should be, an integrated system dedicated to these ends. James, at a commencement address in 1907, argued that nearly anything could be a part of the humanities and liberal arts if it were taught in historical context. Not taught thus, he said, literature remains grammar, art a catalog, history a list of dates, and natural science a sheet of formulas and weights and measures. We should also note that Harry Kirk Wolff knew and used a wide range of information in his teaching. He was widely known for invoking examples and instances from art, literature, history, biology, and archaeology in his teaching of philosophy and psychology students. Without doubt, a great liberal artist. We might wonder what these guys would think about psychology today. 54 divisions at the last time I looked at APA, a bunch of new ones in the last couple of decades. Membership in the general psychology division has declined. There are all kinds of new organizations and conferences that pop up all the time. Typical undergraduate departments teach 40 or more different courses. Fewer than half the departments require this list of courses, social abnormal development. Doesn't mean they don't offer them, but not every student has to take all of these, and students can often avoid these courses in undergraduate curricula these days. 2/3 or more don't require history and systems, personality, or cognitive. A couple of days ago, I Googled psychological specialties, 5.5 million hits. I didn't look at many of them. So what would Wolf or James or Alexander say to teachers in the face of specialization, or what I sometimes think is more appropriately called fragmentation of the field? James might counsel teachers that by their tone are all things human, either lost or saved. If democracy is to be saved, it must catch the higher, healthier tone. If we are to impress it with our preferences, we ourselves must use the proper tone, which we in turn must have caught from our own teachers. For Alexander, there were three key qualities that he thought cut across disciplines in the liberal arts. One was love of truth, which he said means honesty with yourself and with fellow human beings. He says freedom of speech and information depend upon this. The second, he said, was love of virtue, which he meant to be the power of self-control and discipline. And third, he said, love of beauty, ability to idealize and imagine better things, to be creative and inventive. Those, he said, should be the three central aims of education, no matter what your field. Alexander would also, I think, be impatient with modern educational technology and all the trappings that come with it. He said the machinery of instruction has become so intricate that more attention is drawn to its operation than to its product. The school should not be a factory, but a garden. I shudder to think what he would have thought about clickers or the kind of things we spend time at conferences talking about. Wolf believed in the, quote, unity of the world, and thought that all students, no matter what field they planned to enter, would benefit from some knowledge of psychology. And I think he had it right. We should also come back to the traits that appear describing Harry Kirk Wolf in the letters and the autobiographies and other things that his students wrote. The list I found included these things: that he was inspiring, passionate, generous, well-read, selfless, addicted to books. He was ethical, organized, demanding, and had an amazing breadth of knowledge. Our best teachers give us the same kind of traits that Wolf's students saw in him. Yet some of those traits, rigor, discipline, serendipity, logic, critical thought, kindness, generosity, probably never appear in a syllabus. Some of our most important contributions are the unintended or incidental consequences of our lives as teachers. Barney described for you 2 or 3 examples in my life where unintended consequences of the behavior of teachers made me a very different person than I might otherwise have been. When Lee Gurel, for whom we have a lecture named at APA, said this, I think he meant these kinds of things. He said, I'm particularly indebted to the schools and teachers that gave me entree to the cultured, educated kind of life I lead. I think his message, and the one Harry Kirk would leave us, is if he could be here to do it, is that we should be mindful of the legacy we leave as teachers, citizens, friends, colleagues, and fellow human beings. We're not all William James or Hartley Burr Alexander or Harry Kirk Wolf, but we can all find truth, virtue, and beauty in our classrooms. And I think that ultimately your effectiveness will not depend so much on the polish of your presentation as the legitimate effort, integrity, and care that go into your teaching. Thank you.